Utterly broken, Jebediah McGrow sat beside a rough wooden cradle and watched his newborn daughter slowly fade. Though he was a man who had survived the most violent avalanches of the Colorado Rockies, he now trembled as his massive, calloused hands offered the infant a scrap of wool soaked in goat's milk. He had buried his wife beneath the frozen earth just 3 days prior, and his absolute breaking point had finally arrived. Hope felt entirely dead as the infant's frail, breathless wails competed with the screaming blizzard outside. Then, cutting through the deafening roar of the storm, 3 distinct, heavy knocks struck his cabin door. The winter of 1895 did not arrive in the San Juan Mountains. It crashed down upon them with the fury of a biblical plague. For Jebediah McGrow, the plummeting temperatures were only a secondary cruel joke played by the heavens. Jeb was a mountain man in the truest sense. He trapped timber wolves, navigated the treacherous passes above Silverton, and lived a life carved out of pine sweat and isolation. He was a man made of granite, but granite can still crack under the right kind of pressure. That pressure was a small, bundled mass of blankets in a cedar cradle, little baby Sasha. Just a week ago, the cabin had been filled with the scent of rising bread and the soft humming of his wife, Elela Nana. Elela Nana had been a sturdy woman from a Kansas farming family, unbothered by the harsh realities of the high country. But the frontier is a merciless thief. The labor had come early, brought on by a sudden fever. Doc Henderson was miles away in the valley, trapped behind snowdrifts that reached the roofs of the stagecoach stations. Jeb had been forced to deliver his own daughter, his hands slick with sweat and terror, only to watch Elela Nana bleed out on their matrimonial bed before the sun crested the peaks. Her final words had been a whispered plea to keep the baby safe, a promise Jeb swore upon his very soul. Now that promise felt like a boulder crushing his chest. The cabin was suffocatingly quiet, save for the crackle of the hearth and Sasha's agonizing, reedy cries. Jeb had tried everything. He had braved the whiteout conditions to milk his single, stubborn mountain goat, boiling the milk and soaking a clean rag for the baby to suckle. But cow and goat milk were harsh on a newborn stomach. Sasha was rejecting it, writhing in the throes of severe colic, a tiny face flushed purple with exertion and starvation. "Please, little bird," Jeb rasped, his voice a growly whisper. He rocked the cradle with a heavy boot, his eyes bloodshot and hollow. "You got to take it just a little swallow." He squeezed a drop of the warm milk onto her chapped lips. She choked, sputtering it back out, and resumed her heartbreaking wail. Jeb slumped back into his rocking chair, dragging his hands down his bearded face. The crushing weight of his failure was physical. He was a man who knew how to skin a buck in 10 minutes, how to read the weather in the clouds, how to survive a week in the wilderness with nothing but a knife and a flint. But looking at the fragile, starving infant, his vast wilderness knowledge was entirely, agonizingly useless. The sheer terrifying vulnerability of this tiny human life mocked his strength. He looked toward the frosted window panes. The blizzard outside was impenetrable, a swirling vortex of white death. The temperature was dropping fast. It was easily 30 below zero. To bundle the baby and attempt the 8-mile trek down the mountain to Silverton would be suicide for both of them. To stay meant watching her slowly starve to death. Jeb stood up, his towering 6'4" frame casting a long, wavering shadow against the log walls. He walked over to the wooden mantel and picked up his Colt single-action revolver. He checked the chamber, not out of any immediate threat, but simply for the mechanical comfort of the action. It was a dark, intrusive thought, a momentary lapse into the abyss of absolute despair. If he lost her, there would be nothing left to keep him tethered to this earth. He set the gun down, disgusted with his own weakness, and walked back to the cradle. He scooped the crying infant into his massive arms, cradling her against the rough wool of his shirt, trying to transfer his body heat to her shivering frame. "I'm sorry, Abby," he whispered into the empty room, tears finally breaching the stoic dam of his eyes, rolling hot and fast into his thick beard. "I don't know how to do this. I'm failing her." Then the impossible happened. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the settling of the cabin logs. It was the deliberate rhythmic sound of human knuckles striking the heavy oak door. Thump, thump, thump. Jeb froze. Every survival instinct honed by decades in the wilderness screamed at him. Nobody, absolutely nobody, was up on this ridge in November. The local Ute tribes had long since moved to lower winter camps, and the silver miners in town wouldn't dare brave the pass in a storm that was currently burying the tree. He laid Sasha back in her cradle, grabbed the colt from the mantle, and approached the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. He unlatched the heavy iron bolt and pulled the door inward. The wind blasted into the room, bringing with it a flurry of blinding snow that instantly extinguished the oil lamp on the nearby table. Standing on his porch, silhouetted against the raging whiteout, was a figure entirely encrusted in ice. It was a woman. She wasn't dressed for the mountains. She wore a heavy dark green velvet traveling cloak that was completely unsuited for a blizzard, its hem frozen solid and heavy with packed snow. Her face was obscured by a woolen scarf, but her eyes wide and glassy, with the final stages of hypothermia locked onto Jeb's. She was clutching a worn leather carpet bag to her chest with a death grip. Before Jeb could utter a word, the woman's knees buckled. She pitched forward, collapsing face first across the threshold of the cabin. "Lord Almighty," Jeb muttered, shoving his revolver into his belt. He grabbed the woman under her arms, surprised by how terrifyingly light she was. He dragged her fully into the cabin and threw his weight against the door, fighting the gale-force wind to slam it shut and throw the bolt. The sudden silence of the sealed room was deafening, save for the baby's continued crying and the ragged, shallow breathing of the stranger on his floor. Jeb moved quickly. He knew hypothermia intimately. He hauled her limp body over to the bearskin rug in front of the roaring hearth. He peeled away the frozen velvet cloak, revealing a finely tailored, though badly torn Victorian day dress underneath. Her hands were blue, her fingers stiff. He rubbed snow on her extremities to slowly introduce circulation, a harsh but necessary mountain remedy, before wrapping her tightly in his own heavy buffalo robe. As he worked, the scarf fell away from her face. She was young, perhaps in her late 20s, with sharp, aristocratic features that seemed entirely out of place in a trapper's cabin. Her skin was as pale as the snow outside, her dark hair plastered to her cheeks with frozen sweat. For an hour, Jeb tended to the fire-boiling snow for hot water and alternating between watching the stranger and desperately trying to soothe the crying baby. Finally, a violent shiver racked the woman's body. A low moan escaped her blue lips, and her eyelids fluttered open. She stared blankly at the rough timber ceiling, disoriented before her gaze snapped to Jeb, who was kneeling beside her with a tin cup of hot water. Panic flared in her eyes, and she instinctively pushed herself backward, scrambling weakly against the floorboards. "Easy now," Jeb said, keeping his voice low and steady, holding his hands up to show he was unarmed. "You're safe. You're in my cabin. You walked right out of the storm." The woman continued to stare at him, her chest heaving as she processed her surroundings. Then the sound pierced the air again. Sasha, waking from a brief, exhausted slumber, began to scream a thin, reedy sound of absolute distress. The stranger's demeanor changed instantly. The fear in her eyes vanished, replaced by an acute laser-like focus. She struggled to sit up, throwing off the heavy buffalo robe. "What is that?" she demanded, her voice in roar from the cold. "My daughter," Jeb replied, his voice heavy with defeat. "She's starving. My wife passed. 3 days ago, the baby won't take goat's milk. I don't know what to do." The woman didn't hesitate. She didn't ask for permission. Despite her own near-death state, a profound, almost aggressive maternal instinct seemed to override her physical weakness. She pushed past Jeb, stumbling slightly as her frozen legs remembered how to bear weight, and knelt beside the cradle. She looked down at the purple, thrashing infant, her hands hovering over the baby's chest. "She's freezing and she's cramping. The milk you gave her is too rich. It's tearing up her bowels." "Who are you?" Jeb asked, stunned by her sudden authority. "My name is Clarina," she said briskly, not looking up. "Clarina Higgins. Where is my bag?" "The leather one." Jeb retrieved the carpet bag from near the door and handed it to her. Clarina ripped it open. Inside, amidst a few folded clothes, were several small glass apothecaries and tins. She pulled out a small tin of what looked like dried herbs and a tiny clean cotton cloth. "Boil water, fresh water, not snow melt from the roof," Clarina ordered, "and get me a clean bowl." Jeb, for the first time in days, felt a spark of hope. He followed her commands without question. When he brought the boiling water, Clarina steeped a pinch of the herbs, fennel, and chamomile, she explained, into a weak tea. She mixed a very small amount of the goat's milk into it, diluting it heavily, and soaked the clean cloth. Gently, expertly, she lifted baby Sasha. Clarina cradled the infant in the crook of her arm angled her perfectly, and introduced the cloth to the baby's lips. For a terrifying minute, Sasha refused it, but Clarina hummed a low rhythmic melody, stroking the baby's cheek to stimulate the rooting reflex. Slowly, miraculously, the baby latched onto the cloth. She began to suckle, pulling the diluted, soothing mixture into her tiny body. Jeb stood by the hearth, watching the scene unfold. The tension that had coiled around his spine for days finally snapped. He sank into his chair, burying his face in his hands, letting out a long, shuddering breath. The wailing had stopped. The cabin was filled only with the crackle of the fire and the soft, urgent sounds of a baby finally taking nourishment. Clarina looked up at him, her face softening for a brief moment. "She's going to be all right, Mr. McGraw," Jeb said, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "Jebediah McGraw, I owe you my daughter's life, Miss Clarina." "We owe each other, Mr. McGraw," Clarina replied, looking back down at the sleeping infant. "I would be a block of ice right now if you hadn't opened that door." By nightfall, the dynamic in the small cabin had fundamentally shifted. A fragile, unspoken truce had settled over the space. Sasha was finally sleeping soundly in her cradle, her stomach settled by Clarina's herbal mixture. Clarina had regained some color in her cheeks and was sitting in Elena's rocking chair, wrapped in a blanket, staring into the flames. Jeb sat at the small wooden table cleaning his rifle, a habit that brought him comfort, but also allowed him an excuse to watch his unexpected guest. Gratitude washed over him every time he looked at his sleeping daughter. But alongside that gratitude, a heavy, dark suspicion began to take root in his mind. "You never did tell me," Jeb said casually, sliding the bolt of the rifle back with a metallic clack. "What brings a woman in a velvet cloak up to the Devil's Ridge in the dead of November?" Clarina stiffened slightly, though she didn't turn away from the fire. "I was traveling to Tellide," she said, her voice smooth, rehearsed. "I'm to meet my uncle there. He owns a mercantile. The stagecoach broke an axle down in the valley. The driver said it would take 2 days to fix, so I decided to walk to the nearest settlement. I got turned around when the snow started." Jeb stopped wiping the rifle barrel. He set the rag down slowly. "That's so," Jeb asked, his tone deceptively mild. "The stage route to Tellide runs through the Anima Valley. That's a good 15 minutes west to here, down at a much lower elevation. To get turned around and end up on Devil's Ridge, you would have had to cross a freezing river scale, a sheer rock face, and hike uphill through waist-deep snow for 6 hours." Clarina finally looked at him. Her eyes, illuminated by the firelight, held a sudden, sharp weariness. "I assure you, Mr. McGraw," the storm was blinding, "a person can wander far off course when they can't see their own hand in front of their face." "Maybe," Jeb conceded, leaning back in his chair, "but a woman walking from a broken stagecoach usually brings her trunk, or at least asks the driver for directions. She doesn't usually set off into the wilderness, carrying nothing but a carpet bag." "I took what was essential," Clarina said, her voice dropping an octave, losing its prior warmth. Jeb didn't press further. He knew when to let a trapped animal breathe, but his wilderness instincts were screaming louder than before. The woman was lying. Her clothes were expensive, too expensive for a mercantile owner's niece, and her hands, though capable, lacked the heavy calluses of someone used to hard frontier labor. Later that evening, exhausted by the trauma of the past few days, Clarina drifted off to sleep in the rocking chair. Jeb remained awake. The fire had burned down to glowing red embers, casting long, dancing shadows across the cabin. He quietly stood up and moved silently across the room. He didn't want to violate the trust of the woman who had just saved his daughter, but a man alone in the wild couldn't afford blind spots. If he was harboring a criminal or worse, someone who would bring danger to his doorstep, he needed to know. Clarina's carpet bag rested on the floor near her feet, moving with the silent grace of a hunter. Jeb knelt beside it. The brass clasp was unlatched. He gently opened the bag, careful not to make a sound. The apothecaries and tins were neatly arranged. Beneath them lay a folded silk chamisole and a few basic toiletry items. But as he pressed his hand against the bottom of the bag, he felt something hard and metallic wrapped tightly in a thick piece of canvas. He glanced at Clarina. She was breathing deeply, fast asleep. Jeb carefully unwrapped the canvas. His breath caught in his throat. Resting in his palm was a heavy, solid gold pocket watch. It was a beautiful, ornate piece clearly worth a small fortune. But that wasn't what made Jeb's blood run cold. The gold casing was deeply stained with dark, dried blood. It had seeped into the intricate engravings on the cover. Using his thumb, Jeb rubbed away enough of the dried blood to read the inscription to Mayor Edward Penfield for honorable service to the city of Denver. 1880. Jeb stared at the watch, the pieces of a very dangerous puzzle falling into place. Edward Penfield wasn't just a mayor. He was one of the most powerful, ruthless mining barons in the territory. Word had reached Silverton weeks ago via the telegraph office. Mayor Penfield had been brutally murdered in his own study, his safe emptied. The Pinkerton Detective Agency had put a massive bounty on the killer. Jeb slowly wrapped the bloody watch back in the canvas and returned it to the bottom of the bag. He stood up looking down at the sleeping woman who had just breathed life back into his daughter. Clarina Higgins wasn't a lost traveler. She was a woman on the run for her life, carrying the bloody spoils of a high-profile murder. And now she had brought the wrath of the Pinkertons straight to Jeb's front door. The blizzard howled for 2 more days, an endless, shrieking beast that battered the cabin logs and buried the windows under feet of packed drift. Inside, the world had shrunk to the warm 20OX 20FT radius radiating from the stone hearth. For Jeb, those 48 hours were a waking fever dream of conflicting emotions. He watched Clarina Higgins tend to his daughter with a devotion that bordered on holy. She rarely slept, waking at Sasha's softest whimper. She washed the linen, carefully managed the dwindling goat's milk, and sang quiet, mournful lullabies in French, a language Jeb didn't understand, but one that seemed to soothe the infant's troubled soul. Clarina was a savior. She was the only reason the tiny cradle wasn't a coffin. But every time Jeb looked at her pale, refined face, his mind flashed back to the heavy gold pocket watch and the crust of dried blood in its engravings. On the morning of the 3rd day, the wind finally broke. The sudden silence was heavier than the storm had been. Pale, anemic sunlight fought its way through the frost on the upper window panes, casting long, sharp shadows across the floorboards. Clarina was at the table, carefully folding one of Elena's old flannel shirts to use as a makeshift diaper. Jeb stood by the fireplace, nursing a tin cup of bitter, Cory-laced coffee. The time for waiting had passed. The storm was over, which meant the isolation of Devil's Ridge would soon be breached. Jeb walked to the table. He didn't speak. He reached into his deep canvas pocket, withdrew the canvas-wrapped bundle, and set it down softly on the rough, hewn wood next to Clarina's hands. He unfolded the canvas, revealing the heavy gold watch. The blood stain caught the morning light a dull, rusted crimson. Clarina stopped moving. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin the shade of old parchment. She stared at the watch, her hands trembling so violently that she had to grip the edge of the table to steady herself. She didn't feign ignorance. She didn't gasp. She simply closed her eyes, a profound, weary resignation settling over her shoulders. I saw the telegraphs down in Silverton before the snow hit. Jeb said, his voice a low, steady rumble in the quiet cabin. Pinkertons are offering $1,000 for the phantom who gutted Mayor Edward Penfield in his Denver study. $1,000 is a lot of money to bring a killer to justice. Clarina opened her eyes and finally looked up at him. There was fear there, raw and undeniable, but beneath it lay a hardened core of defiance. If you intend to turn me in for the bounty, Mr. McGraw, I ask only that you wait until the baby is fully weaned onto cow's milk, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I have enough chamomile left for 3 weeks. After that, her stomach should be strong enough. Jeb frowned, his brow furrowing. You're a fugitive carrying the bloody spoils of a murdered man, and your first concern is my daughter's digestion. My first concern, Mr. McGraw, is that an innocent life doesn't pay for the sins of the wicked. Clarina snapped, a sudden fire igniting in her eyes. She stood up, pushing the chair back. I did not kill Edward Penfield, but I was there when he took his last breath, and if I hadn't run, I would be buried right next to him. Jeb crossed his arms, his massive frame blocking the only exit. I'm listening. Clarina took a ragged breath, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Edward Penfield was my uncle by marriage. When my parents died of cholera in St. Louis, he took me in. He paraded me around Denver society as his charitable ward. But behind the doors of his mansion, she swallowed hard, averting her eyes. He was a monster, Mr. McGraw, a cruel, sadistic man who used his wealth to buy the silence of his servants and the complicity of the local law. She looked back at the watch on the table, her expression twisting with disgust. He was in bed with the mining syndicates extorting independent prospectors. A man named Caleb Montgomery was his enforcer. Caleb wanted my uncle's empire. 4 nights ago, Caleb came into the study while I was organizing the library. I hid behind the heavy velvet drapes. I watched Caleb slide a hunting knife into my uncle's chest. Jeb's eyes narrowed. If you hid, how did you get the watch? Caleb emptied the safe, but he dropped the watch in the struggle. Clarina explained, her voice trembling as the memory overtook her. When Caleb left to fetch his men to dispose of the body, I knew he would find me. I knew I was the only witness. I crept out, but I had no money, nothing to my name. I took the watch from the floor where it had fallen in the blood. I ran to the train station, bought a ticket west under a false name, and just kept running. She looked at Jeb, tears welling in her dark eyes. I brought it to sell in Telluride to buy passage to California. I didn't kill him, but Caleb Montgomery as the Denver police and half the Pinkerton agency on his payroll. If they find me, they won't put me on trial. They'll put a bullet in the back of my head. Jeb studied her face. A man who lived his life tracking animals learned how to read the truth in a creature's eyes. Clarina wasn't lying. The sheer, unadulterated terror radiating from her was impossible to fake. He reached out, picked up the watch, and wrapped it back in the canvas. He walked over to Clarina's carpet bag, dropped the bundle inside, and clicked the brass latch shut. There's a Winchester 73 above the door, Jeb said quietly, turning back to her. Do you know how to shoot? Clarina blinked, stunned by the sudden shift. I can fire a Derringer, a rifle. No, I'll teach you, Jeb said. He looked toward the frosted window out at the blinding white expanse of the mountains. Because a storm like that doesn't just bury tracks, it forces men to hunker down. But now the sky is clear, and if Caleb Montgomery has men tracking you, they'll be moving up the valley by noon. The thaw came fast and brutal, as it often did in the San Juans. The sun beat down on the snowpack, turning the powdery drifts into heavy wet slush that groaned and shifted dangerously on the steep inclines. For 3 days, a strange domestic rhythm took hold in the cabin. Jeb and Clarina worked side by side. He taught her how to hold the heavy Winchester against her shoulder, how to sight down the barrel, and how to cycle the lever without jamming the mechanism. She taught him how to properly swaddle Sasha, how to test the temperature of the milk against the inside of his wrist, and how to rock her at the precise tempo that eased her to sleep. The shared grief that hung over the cabin began to transform into a quiet, profound respect. Jeb found himself watching Clarina as she brushed her dark hair by the firelight, admiring the fierce, unbroken spirit that had carried her through a blizzard and a murder plot. Clarina, in turn, saw the gentle giant beneath the mountain man's rugged exterior. A man whose heart had been shattered by the loss of his wife, yet who poured every ounce of his massive strength into protecting the tiny, fragile life left behind. Late one afternoon, while Sasha slept, Clarina was kneading dough at the table. Jeb was sharpening his hunting knife on a wet stone. The rhythmic esh of the steel on stone filled the quiet air. Eleanor used to hum when she baked, Jeb said suddenly, his voice thick. It was the first time he had spoken his wife's name aloud to Clarina. Clarina stopped kneading. She wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron and looked at him, her eyes soft with empathy. She must have been a remarkable woman to build a life up here. She was tough as boodle and sweet as wild honey. Jeb smiled, a sad, distant look in his eyes. He set the knife down. I never thought I'd hear singing in this cabin again. I thank you for that, Clarina. Clarina walked over to him, hesitating for a moment before placing a flour-dusted hand on his broad shoulder. You are a good father, Jebediah. Sasha is lucky to have you, and so am I. The physical contact, the first genuine touch between them, sent a jolt through Jeb. He looked up at her, really looked at her, and saw the faint blush rising on her cheeks. The space between them seemed to shrink heavy with unspoken tension, and the terrifying vulnerability of two lonely souls finding an anchor in the storm. But the wilderness does not care for romance, and it rarely allows for peace. The next morning, Jeb strapped on his snowshoes and grabbed his brass spyglass. He needed to check his lower trap lines for food, but more importantly, he needed a vantage point. He hiked 2 miles down the treacherous slushy ridge to a jagged outcropping known as Eagle's Beak, which offered a sweeping view of the valley below. He lay flat on his stomach on the cold rock, extended the spyglass, and brought the distant tree line into focus. His blood turned to ice. 3 down, winding their way up the treacherous switchbacks of the pass, were 4 men on horseback. They were wearing heavy dark dusters, their horses struggling through the deep wet snow. But it wasn't the dusters that made Jeb's stomach drop. Riding at the front, leading the group with the predatory slouch of a seasoned tracker, was a man Jeb recognized instantly. It was Josiah Gray Tucker. Tucker was a notorious bounty hunter out of Durango, a man who didn't care about the law, only the gold. If Tucker was leading them, they weren't lawmen looking for a civilized arrest. They were assassins, and they were following the broken branches and displaced snow of Clarina's erratic, desperate trail straight toward Devil's Ridge. Jeb scrambled backward, collapsing the spyglass. He had at best 2 hours. Jeb burst through the cabin door, his chest heaving, bringing a blast of frigid air with him. Clarina jumped, dropping the tin cup she was washing. "Get your bag," Jeb ordered, moving immediately to the weapons rack. He pulled down a double-barreled shotgun, breaking it open and shoving 2 brass shells into the chambers. "Wrap the baby?" "Double layers now." Clarina didn't ask questions. She saw the absolute deadly focus in his eyes. "Who is it?" 4 men, bounty hunters. "They're coming up the switchbacks," Jeb said, strapping a bandolier of ammunition across his chest. He shoved his Colt revolver into his holster and grabbed the Winchester he had taught her to use. "Take this." He shoved the rifle into her hands. Clarina looked down at the heavy weapon, her hands shaking slightly, but she gripped it tight. "We can't outrun them in this slush with a baby," Jeb said, his mind racing through tactical scenarios. "The avalanche chutes are unstable. If we try to cross the high pass, we'll all be buried. We have to hold them off here." "Jeb," Clarina said, her voice catching, "they want me. If I walk out there, if I give myself up, if you walk out there, they'll shoot you dead in the snow and then come in here to eliminate the witnesses." Jeb growled, his voice a terrifying rumble. He stepped close to her, his massive hands gripping her shoulders. "You listen to me. You saved my daughter. You are under my protection. Nobody takes you from this mountain while I still have breath in my lungs. Do you understand me?" Clarina looked up into his fierce, unyielding eyes. The fear in her chest was entirely eclipsed by a sudden, overwhelming surge of awe for the man standing before her. She nodded, her jaw setting firmly. "I understand," they worked frantically. Jeb overturned the heavy oak dining table, pushing it in front of the front window to create a barricade. He knocked out the glass of the 2 smaller side windows, creating firing ports. Clarina bundled Sasha into a thick wool blanket and placed the cradle in the safest, most reinforced corner of the cabin, behind the heavy stone of the fireplace. 45 minutes later, the dreadful sound of horses fighting through the snow reached their ears. Jeb crouched behind the overturned table, the barrel of his shotgun resting on the splintered wood. Clarina was stationed at the side window, the Winchester trembling slightly against her shoulder. "Stay low," Jeb whispered. "Don't fire until I do." Outside, the riders crested the ridge, pulling their exhausted horses to a halt 50 yards from the cabin. Jeb watched through a crack in the table. Josiah Tucker dismounted, a long-barreled Sharps rifle resting easily in his arm. The other 3 men fanned out, drawing their revolvers. "Hello, the cabin," Tucker yelled, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Jebediah McGraw, we know you're in there." Jeb remained silent, his finger resting lightly on the shotgun's triggers. "We ain't got no quarrel with you, mountain man." "Sakala Kimwe," Tucker shouted, taking a few steps closer. "We're looking for a woman goes by Clarina Higgins. She's wanted for the murder of Mayor Penfield in Denver. The bounty is $1,000. You send her out, we'll split the purse with you 500 gold eagles. She ain't here." Jeb finally bellowed back, his voice booming over the snow. "You boys are trespassing on my claim. Turn around and ride back to the valley." Tucker laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Don't play the fool, McGraw. We followed her tracks right to your porch. Now Caleb Montgomery wants this handled quiet-like. He said to tell the girl that if she hands over the ledger she stole, he might let her live." Jeb glanced at Clarina. She was pale as a ghost. "The ledger," Jeb whispered. "It was in my bag," Clarina whispered back, tears forming in her eyes, hidden in the lining. "It proves Caleb was skimming from the syndicates. It proves everything." Tucker's patience was gone. "All right, McGraw. You want to die for a Denver. That's your funeral." Tucker raised the Sharps rifle and fired. The heavy slug slammed through the cabin door, sending a shower of lethal wood splinters into the room. The concussive boom of the gunshot made baby Sasha scream in terror. The battle for Devil's Ridge had begun. "Fire!" Jeb roared. He stood up from behind the table, leveled the double-barreled shotgun through the window, and pulled the right trigger. The deafening roar of buckshot ripped through the air. One of the men advancing on the left flank took the brunt of the blast, screaming as he was thrown backward into the snow. Simultaneously, the sharp crack of the Winchester echoed through the cabin. Clarina, her eyes squeezed half shut, pulled the trigger. Her shot went wide, kicking up a plume of snow near Tucker's boots, but it forced the bounty hunter to dive behind a cluster of pine trees. The remaining two men opened fire, peppering the cabin with a hail of revolver bullets. Slugs thumped into the thick log walls, shattering plates on the shelves, and filling the air with the smell of pulverized wood and gunpowder. Jeb dropped down, ejected the spent shotgun shell, and shoved a fresh one in. "Keep firing, Clarina. Cycle the lever. Don't let them rush the porch." Clarina forced her panic down. She thought of the monster, Caleb Montgomery. She thought of the cold, bloody floor of the Denver study. She thought of the crying infant behind the fireplace. She gritted her teeth, jacked the lever of the Winchester, aimed carefully at a dark duster moving between the trees, and fired. A yelp of pain confirmed she had clipped one of them. "Good girl," Jeb shouted, but Tucker was a seasoned killer. He wasn't going to engage in a blind shootout. Jeb watched through the smoke as Tucker signaled his remaining uninjured man. The man broke cover, running not toward the cabin, but toward the shed, where Jeb kept his kerosene and trapping supplies. Jeb's blood ran cold. "They're going to burn us out." He threw the shotgun down and drew his Colt. He had to stop the man before he reached the fuel. Jeb kicked the heavy oak door open, exposing himself to the freezing air and incoming fire, and stepped out onto the porch. He raised the Colt, fanning the hammer with blinding speed. Bam! 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 The man running for the shed stumbled, hit in the thigh, and collapsed into the snow. But Jeb had stepped into the open. From the treine, Josiah Tucker stepped out, raising his Sharps rifle with deadly precision, aiming dead center at Jebediah's broad chest. There was a deafening crack, but it didn't come from Tucker's rifle. Tucker stiffened, a look of profound shock crossing his scarred face. His rifle dropped from his hands into the snow. He swayed for a moment, then pitched forward dead before he hit the ground. Jeb turned slowly, his heart hammering in his throat. Standing in the shattered window of the cabin, smoke curling from the barrel of the Winchester 73, was Clarina. Her face was smudged with gunpowder, her hands shaking violently, but her eyes were locked on the fallen bounty hunter. She had made an impossible 50-yard shot through the chaos. The remaining injured man, seeing his leader dead and his comrades down, didn't hesitate. He scrambled onto his horse, hauling his wounded partner up behind him, and spurred the animal down the mountain in a desperate, panicked retreat. Silence descended on Devil's Ridge once more, broken only by the wails of baby Sasha and the hiss of hot brass cooling in the snow. Jeb walked back into the cabin, his boots crunching on broken glass. He took the rifle from Clarina's trembling hands and set it against the wall. Then, without a word, he pulled her into a fierce, desperate embrace. Clarina collapsed against his chest, burying her face in his heavy wool coat, finally letting the tears fall. Jeb wrapped his massive arms around her, burying his face in her dark hair, holding her as if he would never let go. They had survived the storm. They had survived the hunters. And in the bloody aftermath on the mountain peak, a fragile, enduring bond had been forged in fire and ice. The adrenaline that had sustained them through the chaotic violence slowly bled away, replaced by the bitter, biting reality of their situation. The cabin, once a sanctuary of quiet grief, now wryer of cordite copper and shattered pine. The biting wind howled through the broken window panes, swirling fine crystalline snow across the blood-splattered floorboards. Jebediah did not allow them to rest. The wilderness was unforgiving, and the dead attracted scavengers, both animal and human. He spent the next hour dragging the bodies of Josiah Tucker and his fallen man 50 yards down into a deep rocky ravine, covering them hastily with loose shale and packed snow. It wasn't a burial born of respect, but of necessity. He didn't want a pack of starving timber wolves drawn to his doorstep with a newborn inside. When Jeb returned kicking the snow from his boots, he found Clarina sitting on the bearskin rug. She had pulled the heavy dining table back into its rightful place and swept the glass into a corner. Baby Sasha, exhausted from her terrified crying during the gunfight, was fast asleep against Clarina's chest, securely wrapped in the thick buffalo robe. Clarina was staring into the flames, her face pale, a smudged streak of gunpowder stark against her cheek. Jeb walked over his heavy footsteps, muffled by the wood shavings. He knelt beside her, reaching out a massive calloused hand to gently wipe the soot from her face. His thumb brushed her cheekbone, the contact lingering for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. "You held your ground," Jeb said, his voice, a low, growly rumble that vibrated in his chest. "I've seen seasoned cavalry men freeze up under fire like that. You saved my life out there, Clarina." Clarina leaned slightly into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut for a moment before she looked up at him. "You gave me no choice, Jebediah. You stepped out into the open for me. I couldn't let you die." She shifted Sasha gently to her other arm, freeing her right hand. She reached into the bodice of her torn velvet dress and produced a small leather-bound book. It was slightly larger than a deck of cards, the cover stained with water and age. "This is what Caleb Montgomery sent them for," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "The ledger," Jeb took the book from her. The leather was supple, the pages densely packed with sharp, cramped handwriting. He moved closer to the hearth, angling the pages toward the firelight. As he read, his brow furrowed, deepening the lines weathered into his face by years of high-altitude sun and wind. "Lord Almighty," Jeb breathed. The ledger was a meticulous, damning record of a sprawling criminal empire. It detailed payments made by Edward Penfield to city judges, local sheriffs, and prominent politicians. But more importantly, it documented the systemic skimming and extortion orchestrated by Caleb Montgomery behind Penfield's back. Caleb had been bleeding the powerful mining syndicates dry, diverting hundreds of thousands of dollars in gold and silver bullion to hidden accounts back east. "Montgomery didn't just kill my uncle to take over," Clarina explained, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and vindication. "My uncle caught him stealing from the syndicates. He was going to expose Caleb to the syndicate bosses. That's a death sentence in Denver. Caleb killed him to cover his tracks, and he needed this ledger destroyed." Jeb closed the book, the implications settling heavily over him. If the Denver police and the local Pinkertons are on his payroll, handing this over to any badge in this county is a one-way ticket to a pine box. "Then what do we do?" Clarina asked, the despair creeping back into her tone. "That man who rode away, he'll make it back to the valley. He'll wire Caleb. They will send more men, an army if they have to." "We don't wait for them," Jeb said, his jaw setting with a fierce, absolute resolve. "We pack the sled. We take the high pass down to Durango. It's a 3-day trek, and the trail is treacherous this time of year, but it bypasses the telegraph towns. Durango has a federal courthouse. U.S. Marshal Elias Boone runs that district. He's an old breed, stubborn, ornery, and entirely unbribable. If we get this ledger to him, Montgomery hangs." Clarina looked down at the sleeping infant. "Can Sasha survive a 3-day journey in the open?" "She has to," Jeb said, his eyes locking onto Clarina's. "Because if we stay here, none of us survive. I'll build a hooded travois to keep the wind off her." We leave at first light. That night there was no sleep. They worked in a synchronized silent rhythm. Jeb stripped the cabin of provisions, dried venison, hardtack, the remaining coffee, and every round of ammunition they possessed. Clarina boiled water, steeped the last of her chamomile, and prepared a sturdy insulated nesting box for Sasha, using Elelena's thickest quilts and the cedar cradle. As the first gray light of dawn began to bleed over the jagged peaks of the San Juans, Jeb stood on the porch, staring out at the frozen expanse. The wind had died down to a whisper, but the air was brittle and unforgiving. He turned to look at Clarina. She was bundled in his spare wool coat, a rifle slung over her shoulder, the baby secured to her chest beneath the heavy layers. She looked entirely out of place, a city woman thrust into a brutal frontier nightmare. Yet she possessed a quiet, unbreakable dignity that commanded his absolute respect. He walked over to her, adjusting the collar of the coat around her neck. "It's going to be the hardest ride of your life," he warned softly. Clarina looked up at him, her dark eyes flashing with a fierce protective light. I've already lost everything once, Jebediah. I am not losing this family. Lead the way. The word hung in the freezing air between them. Family. Jeb felt a sudden profound tightening in his chest. He nodded once, grabbed the ropes of the supply sled, and stepped out into the snow. The journey down Devil's Ridge was a grueling descent into a frozen purgatory. The Thor had created a deceptive landscape. What looked like solid snowpack was often a thin crust over deep rushing meltwater or jagged shale. For the first 2 days they spoke little, conserving their energy for the brutal physical toll of the mountain. Jeb broke the trail, his massive snowshoes acting as plows, his muscles burning as he dragged the heavy sled behind him. Clarina followed closely in his tracks, her every thought focused on the steady rise and fall of Sasha's breathing against her chest. When the baby cried, they huddled beneath an overhang of rock, Jeb shielding them with his broad body, while Clarina administered the diluted milk and herbal mixture. By the afternoon of the 3rd day, the air began to thicken. The bitter, sterile smell of the high peaks gave way to the scent of damp earth and ponderosa pine. They had descended below the Treine, entering the treacherous winding canyon known as Dead Man's Wash. We're close, Jeb rasped, his beard crusted with ice, 5 miles to the valley floor. There's a way station at Miller's Crossing. Old man named Zeke runs it. We can buy fresh horses there and make a hard ride for Durango by nightfall. Clarina nodded, her face gaunt from exhaustion. Her boots were soaked through her legs, trembling with every step. But she did not complain. She simply tightened her grip on her rifle and kept moving forward. They reached Miller's Crossing just as the sun began to dip behind the canyon walls, casting the valley into deep purple shadows. The way station was a ramshackle collection of timber buildings, a livery, a small trading post, and a saloon that catered to transient miners and cattle drivers. Jeb left Clarina and the baby hidden in a dense thicket of spruce near the edge of the property. While he went ahead to scout, he approached the livery cautiously, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt. The stable doors were wide open. Inside, he found Zeke, a weathered, stooped man with a shock of white hair, frantically trying to saddle a pair of roans. Zeke, Jeb said softly, stepping out of the shadows. The old man jumped, dropping a cinch strap. When he recognized Jeb, his eyes widened in terror. Jebediah, Lord have mercy, boy. You need to get out of here right now. I need 2 horses. Zeke, you're best. I have gold, Jeb said, pulling a pouch from his coat. Gold ain't gonna do you no good if you're dead, Zeke hissed, glancing nervously toward the saloon. They're here, Jeb. A dozen of them. Rode in 2 hours ago on a specialized train car down at the depot. Then bought up every horse I had. Jeb's blood ran cold. Who is here? City men in expensive dusters, heavily armed, Zeke whispered. And the man leading them, dressed in a fine tailored suit, coldest eyes I ever seen. They're tearing the valley apart, looking for a woman, Caleb Montgomery. He hadn't waited for the telegraph. When Tucker failed to report back, Montgomery had utilized his vast wealth to charter a private train, bringing his personal army directly to the base of the mountain to intercept them. Where are they? Jeb demanded. Half of them rode up the Animus Trail. The other half, including the man in the suit, are drinking my whiskey in the saloon, waiting for the scouts to report back. Zeke said, Jeb, if they catch you, they won't, Jeb said. Saddle those roams, Zeke. Tie them out back by the creek. Do it now. Jeb sprinted back to the spruce thicket. He found Clarina huddled over Sasha, her face tense. He's here, Jeb said, his voice urgent. Montgomery. He brought a small army there in the saloon. Clarina's breath hitched. How did he? Money buys speed, Jeb interrupted, pulling her to her feet. Zeke is getting horses ready out back. We have to skirt the saloon to get to them. Keep your head down. If shooting starts, you run for the tree line and don't look back. You get this ledger to Marshal Boone. I am not leaving you, Clarina stated, her voice surprisingly steady. You will do exactly as I say, Jeb growled, a desperate edge to his voice. He grabbed her by the shoulders, looking deeply into her eyes. If I fall, you keep this child safe. That is a promise you make me right now, Clarina. Tears welled in her eyes, but she nodded sharply. I promise. They moved like ghosts through the twilight, using the cover of a long wooden water trough and a stack of whiskey barrels to inch closer to the rear of the livery. They were 50 out from the horses. Zeke was standing by the reins, waving them forward frantically. Suddenly, the back door of the saloon swung open with a violent crash. A man stepped out onto the porch, lighting a cigar. He wore a heavy wool duster over a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, a gold watch chain gleaming against his vest. He possessed a handsome, aristocratic face marred by a cruel, arrogant sneer. Caleb Montgomery, he struck a match, the sudden flare illuminating the alleyway. As he brought the flame to his cigar, his eyes scanned the darkness, locking directly onto the movement behind the whiskey barrels. Montgomery didn't shout. He didn't flinch. He simply dropped the match, drew a silver-plated Smith & Wesson from his shoulder holster with lightning speed and fired. The bullet splintered the barrel an inch from Karina's head, showering her with bourbon and wood shards. "We have rats in the alley, boys," Montgomery roared, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Kill the mountain man. The woman is mine." The twilight erupted into blinding flashes of gunfire. 5 hired gunmen spilled out of the saloon, revolvers blazing. Jeb reacted with primal instinct. He shoved Karina hard to the dirt behind the thick oak barrels, stood up to his full towering height, and leveled his Winchester. He didn't fire at the men. He fired at the massive kerosene-filled lantern hanging above the saloon's back porch. The bullets shattered the glass. Gallons of flaming kerosene rained down onto the dry wooden decking, instantly igniting into a towering inferno. 2 of the gunmen screamed as the burning oil splashed across their dusters, forcing them to drop their weapons and roll desperately in the dirt. The wall of fire created a momentary blinding barrier between Jeb and the remaining shooters. "Run!" Jeb bellowed, hauling Karina to her feet. They sprinted for the livery. Zeke had already tied the horses and fled into the woods. Karina scrambled onto the back of the first ran, awkwardly clutching the baby to her chest with one arm while grabbing the reins with the other. Jeb grabbed the horn of his saddle, preparing to mount when a heavy caliber bullet tore through the fleshy part of his left shoulder. The impact spun him around, dropping him to his knees in the mud. He gasped, the sudden searing pain radiating down to his fingertips. Through the smoke and the flames, Caleb Montgomery emerged. He was untouched by the fire, his silver revolver leveled directly at Jeb's head. He walked with a calm, predatory grace, closing the distance. "A valiant effort, Mr. McGraw," Montgomery sneered, cocking the hammer of his weapon, "but entirely futile. You are a savage playing in a civilized man's game." He shifted his gaze to Karina, who was struggling to control her panicked horse. "Hello, Karina. You've caused me a great deal of expensive inconvenience." Karina leveled her own rifle at Montgomery with one hand, resting the barrel over her forearm to steady it. "Drop the gun, Caleb, or I swear to God, I'll put a bullet through your heart." Montgomery laughed, a cold, empty sound. "You won't shoot. You don't have the stomach for murder, my dear. That was always your uncle's problem, too." "She doesn't have to," Jeb rasped. Montgomery looked down just as Jeb's right hand, hidden by his thick coat, whipped upward. He didn't draw his heavy Colt. There was no time. Instead, he threw his heavy, bone-handled hunting knife with the brutal practiced force of a man who had survived grisly attacks. The blade flashed in the firelight. It buried itself deep into Montgomery's right shoulder, cleanly severing the muscle and pinning his arm backward. Montgomery shrieked in agony, his revolver discharging harmlessly into the sky as it fell from his useless hand. He staggered backward, clutching the hilt of the knife, his arrogant veneer shattering into absolute panic. Jeb didn't wait. Ignoring the blood pouring from his own shoulder, he surged forward like a wounded bear. He hit Montgomery with the force of a runaway locomotive, driving the slick city man into the dirt. Jeb pinned him down, drawing his Colt with his good arm and shoving the hot barrel violently under Montgomery's chin. "Civilized men," Jeb panted, blood dripping from his beard onto Montgomery's tailored suit. "Don't know how to survive in the dirt." The remaining gunmen, seeing their employer pinned and bleeding out, hesitated. They were mercenaries paid to intimidate, not to die in a burning alleyway. As the flames from the saloon began to spread to the adjacent buildings, the distinct, thunderous sound of a large posy approaching at a full gallop echoed down the canyon. "Federal marshals, drop your weapons." A booming voice commanded over the roar of the fire. Through the smoke rode U.S. Marshal Elias Boone, a grizzled veteran with a star pinned to his leather vest, flanked by a dozen heavily armed deputies. They had seen the fire from the ridge and spurred their horses hard. The hired guns threw their weapons into the mud and raised their hands. Jeb slowly pulled the gun away from Montgomery's throat and stood up, swaying slightly. Clarina slid down from her horse, rushing to his side. She pressed her scarf tightly against his bleeding shoulder, her hands shaking, her eyes entirely focused on him. Marshal Boone dismounted and walked over his eyes, scanning the carnage, then resting on the shivering, terrified Montgomery writhing in the mud. He looked at Jeb, noting the bloody knife and the fierce protective stance the mountain man maintained over the woman and the child. "You look like you've been to hell and back, son," Boone said, chewing on an unlit cigar. "I assume you have a good reason for burning down half of Miller's Crossing." Clarina stepped forward, keeping one hand firmly on Jeb's waist. With her other hand, she reached into her coat and produced the leather-bound ledger, holding it out to the marshal. "My name is Clarina Higgins," she said, her voice ringing clear and strong over the crackle of the flames. "And this book contains enough evidence to hang that man and half the politicians in Denver for the murder of Mayor Edward Penfield." Boone took the ledger, his eyebrows rising as he flipped through the first few pages. A slow, grim smile spread across his weathered face. "Well, I'll be damned. The Pinkertons have been tearing up the territory looking for you, Miss Higgins." "The Pinkertons, a compromised marshal," Jeb said, his voice tight with pain. "We brought it to you. Now take this garbage out of my valley." 6 months later, the high country of the Sonon Mountains underwent its magnificent violent rebirth. The suffocating snows melted, sending roaring torrents of crystal water down the granite faces. The valleys exploded into a vibrant sea of Indian paintbrush and wild colleen, painting the world in strokes of purple, red, and gold. The air around the cabin on Devil's Ridge was no longer heavy with the silence of grief. It was filled with the rhythmic sound of a chopping axe, the smell of roasting venison, and the bright melodic laughter of a woman. Jeb stood by the woodpile, his shoulder fully healed, wiping sweat from his brow. He looked toward the porch. Clarina was sitting in the rocking chair, bathing in the warm afternoon sun. She was no longer the fragile, terrified city girl in a torn velvet dress. She wore a simple, durable cotton skirt and one of Jeb's old flannel shirts. Her dark hair braided down her back, her face was tanned, her hands calloused from hard work. But her eyes held a profound, radiant peace. On her lap sat little Sasha, now a robust, healthy 6-month-old, babbling happily as she tried to catch a butterfly that fluttered near the porch railing. Jeb drove the axe into the chopping block and walked over to them. Clarina looked up, a warm, genuine smile spreading across her face. She reached out her hand, finding his. Their fingers intertwined. A gesture born not of necessity, but of a deep, unshakable love forged in the crucible of winter. "She's getting heavy," Clarina amused, pressing a kiss to the top of Sasha's head. "I think she's going to be tall like her father." Jeb knelt beside the chair, wrapping his massive arms around both of them, burying his face in Clarina's neck, breathing in the scent of pine and chamomile. He had lost his world in the bitter cold only to have a new one delivered to his doorstep in the midst of a storm. The frontier was still wild, still dangerous, and still unforgiving. But as Jebediah McGrow looked out over the sprawling, sunlit valley with his family secure in his arms, he knew that they had weathered the worst of it. The winter was over, and in the heart of the mountains, their spring had finally begun. And there you have it, folks, the thrilling and emotional conclusion to the tale of Jebediah McGrow and Clarina Higgins. From a desperate battle for survival against the harsh elements to a blazing showdown against corrupt city barons, their story proves that sometimes the greatest strength isn't found in isolation, but in the family we choose to protect. The Wild West was a place of brutal realities, but also of incredible resilience and unexpected redemption. If this gritty, high-stakes romance kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more immersive historical storytelling. I want to hear your thoughts. Did Jeb make the right call by taking the fight to Caleb Montgomery, or should they have kept running? Leave your answers in the comments below. Share this video with your fellow history buffs and ring that notification bell so you never miss an adventure. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your fires burning.